The art of diplomacy. I aspire to be a diplomat, so I'm quite passionate about this topic. I already know that diplomats have a huge impact on the entire world. Every country views it as a necessity to be able to have diplomats in order to improve or form friendly relations with other countries. Diplomats are the reason why many wars have been avoided. But despite military relations, business relations from country to country that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for diplomats have been created. My testable question is, how has the history of diplomacy affected current diplomatic relations? I came up with this question based on my curiosity on whether or not the history of diplomacy has anything to do with modern-day diplomacy as we know it. In order to answer my testable question, I have done my research and gathered 5 sources. Source 1 claims that traditional diplomacy is dealing with the interface of conflict and peacemaking. Evolution of Diplomacy describes the history of diplomacy and shows that it has become much more than the diplomacy of states and governments. Source 2 states that modern diplomacy began with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended in hostilities in the 30 Years' War. Source 3 supports Source 2 by stating that the Westphalian system still remains the model of international politics around the world, and the concept of state sovereignty, solidified by the peace, is still the basis for modern international treaties and conventions. Source 4 states that SPIES condenses millennia of history by highlighting only the trends and events that shape diplomatic practice as we know it. Source 5 mentions that modern diplomacy's origins are often traced to the states of northern Italy in the early Renaissance, with the first embassies being established in the 13th century. Now for my hypothesis. If the history of diplomacy affected current diplomatic relations, then we'd be able to know that diplomacy is somewhat not evolving and adapting to global changes and developments. Nevertheless, this means that what we do in today's day and age involving international relations will also affect and or still remain the same for the future of diplomacy. In order to conclude my presentation, I'd like to showcase all the websites I've gained my knowledge from in MLA format. Thank you for your attention.